Do that at some point. If Chuck and Nancy, who I'm meeting with, I believe, in a little while, if they don't agree to the fact that our country is really got problems with crime, with drugs, with a lot of other things that come through our southern border. I don't know why it's good politically. You know, I don't care politically. I'm doing what's right for the country. But I'll tell you, it's a very bad political issue for the Democrats.
Pretty bad one for you too, sir. And just moments ago, fireworks from Democrats after a meeting with the president ended in one of the most explosive conflicts we've seen in the nearly 3 weeks of gridlock over the border.
Well, unfortunately, the president just got up and walked out. He asked Speaker Pelosi, "Will you agree to my wall?" She said no. And he just got up and said, "Then we have nothing to discuss," and he just walked out. Again, we saw a temper tantrum because he couldn't get his way, and he just walked out of the meeting. When Leader Pelosi said she didn't agree with the wall, he just walked out and said, "We have nothing to discuss." So he said it was a waste of his time.
The president today increasingly desperate for a way out of the government shutdown as polls show voters blame him. Joining us now, Matt Miller, former chief spokesman for the Justice Department. And here at the table, John Heilman is back, co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus. Eddie Glaude, chairman of Princeton's Center for African American Studies. And Alicia Menendez, co-host of PBS's Amanpour and Company and contributing editor for Bustle. Let me start with you, John Heilman. This is not where a normal president, I hesitate to use that word, expects to be the day after harnessing the communications value of what they call roadblock coverage when the president's address appears on all 5 networks. This is not where you are if you think that went well.
Well, right. Certainly that's true. And of course, we now know from the reporting of Peter Baker and others that the president assumed that it was not going to go well even before he came in. He was, I tweeted last night that he was the first ever presidential address by a collapsed souffle. I mean, he looked defeated, deflated.
Before it ended.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, he looked terrible. I've never really seen Trump. He's never good on prompter.
Right.
Whatever skills he has as a performer are not maximized in that setting. And even, he's even better in the well of the House when he speaks in a formal setting off prompter where he has at least some crowd.
Audience.
Alone to the TV, direct to camera, not his best place. And again, he was saying, he was trashing his staff basically hours before. There's an unprecedented thing. You've never seen that before. I've seen a lot of presidents trash their staffs in private after a speech goes wrong, but he was preempting the badness of the performance beforehand with broadcast anchors.
Well, let's go there. Who would that be? Is that Bill Shine? Is Bill Shine in trouble?
He pointed, I believe, according to the report in the New York Times, he pointed basically at Sarah Sanders and at Kellyanne Conway and at Bill Shine and said, "These 3, my communications aides, are making me do this, and I know it's not going to change anything." And while that reflects a kind of unusual defeatism, it also was a moment of clarity for him because, of course, he was right. There was nothing he was going to say in that speech last night that was actually going to move the needle. He's wrong on the merits. He's bad on the politics. The Democrats aren't going to move. They have the upper hand politically. The country's not with him. So he was right. Nothing he could have said last night was going to change the dynamic, which is why we are now in a place where, although that piece of theater last night, that piece of desultory theater was what it was, we're now back today to really where we were earlier, which is
he's in a worse position
today. He's
now lost 4 senators.
He's in a worse position, although we knew that was going to come because Republicans were going to start to peel off. It was inevitable that Republicans are going to start to peel off as the pain starts to be felt. So now we're there, and we're back to this extraordinary thing where he's talking about doing this marshaling the powers of the federal government, declaring a national emergency when there is none.
The big scam of last night, other than the more than half a dozen lies that were repeated by the President of the United States on roadblock network coverage, is that the actual crisis is a fabrication. Border crossings are at a 45-year low. And again, a normal president would tout that as one of his political successes and run on it. But his whole frame around this entire debate, the entire shutdown, the entire government is shut down over a scam.
That's what's really baffling to me, that we all know, for the most part, that the foundation of this crisis is a lie.
It's like the patient zero of fake news.
It's as if we have Chicken Little in the White House, And he's constantly calling that, you know, the sky is falling, and we're supposed to mobilize, right? But we know he's lying. And so it baffles the mind as we see the gaggle of Chicken Littles after the meeting in the Situation Room.
But he brought candy, Eddie.
Plenty for everyone.
Right? So part of what I'm trying to wrap my mind around is, what does it mean for us to mobilize around and behind a lie? What does it mean for us to respond to it? And I just can't seem to put one and two together.
Well, and I guess the reassuring thing is, for the first moment in the Trump presidency, the lie is a flop. The polls show, we've got some new polling that shows that the shutdown, it looks like it's snowing in Washington. Let's see that. He may not get his wall, but he made it snow, ladies and gentlemen. The polling on the wall and the shutdown is on a bad trajectory for this president. More people blame him now than blamed him when it started.
Right, and you know, 800,000 people come Friday.
Without a paycheck.
Without a paycheck.
Without a check to their mortgages,
right.
without
and think
rents
about
paid.
all those folks at the first of the month.
And they're not shopping. So all those stocks, whew.
Food stamps.
Get ready for some angry tweets.
Right. It's gonna be ugly.
I don't want to lose sort of the you know, this is not, some of his lies are victimless, his weight, whatnot. This is not a victimless lie.
Right.
This is a lie with really the most vulnerable people in this country, and people seeking to come to this country are the victims here. Where are we when our country's president takes to the national airwaves and asks and receives for network coverage, every network agrees, and does what he did last night?
We're in a bad place. I mean, you look at the construction of those remarks. The first part, he admits there's a humanitarian crisis happening, but then takes no responsibility for the fact that he and his administration are the ones who created this humanitarian crisis.
Put babies in jail.
Yes, doesn't talk about the fact that there is metering at the border. If you wanted to be serious about the humanitarian crisis that is happening, you would talk about the push-pull factors that lead people to seek asylum in the United States. You would talk about making a real investment in Central America. That's not what he's interested in doing. From there, he pivots to what is just a series of outrageous lies. You mentioned border crossings are the lowest they've been in 2 decades. In addition to that, he has the entire riff about drugs, which is not true. The majority of the drugs he was talking about come through legal ports of entry. There's no proof. The State Department says that terrorist groups have tried to bring people in through Mexico. And all of this happening, as you said, on the backs of people who are nonviolent, law-abiding, productive members of this society. And for those of us who come from immigrant communities, we recognize that there is a real day-to-day price that is paid by people for those lies.
Matt Miller, I want to bring you in on some of the big lies and ask you to pick up on this thread. I talked yesterday, I mentioned this yesterday in the show, to a former senior intelligence official who said that it was his job to know where all the terrorists were, all the cells and all the actual terrorists. There were none on the southern border. Today there were stories in the papers about how the counterterror folks, the experts, were basically corroborating that. Last night's address emphasized drugs. Drugs are a tragedy. They are an epidemic, but most of them, as Alicia said, come through legal ports of entry. Crime, all crime, horrific. The crimes he described last night, tragedies, full stop. But the truth is that non-immigrants commit crimes at higher levels than immigrants. So how is this sort of the evidence-based agencies, the Justice Department, the CIA, the counterterror folks, it's almost Donald Trump's own government closing in around his spin?
Well, look, I don't think it's a coincidence that after the Trump administration, the White House went out, along with Kirstjen Nielsen, the Homeland Security Secretary, and spent a week talking about the threat of terrorists coming across the southern border, that you saw these numbers come out from inside the government about what was really happening. And we saw Julie Ainsley's great reporting that, in fact, there is not a terrorist threat coming across the southern border. There is a small number of people, I think it was 6 in the first 6 months of last year, who were terrorist suspects or somehow were on a terrorist watch list who were encountered at the southern border. Less than came on the northern border. So I think you see some of the people inside the government who are starting to push back about what they see as a mountain of lies coming from the White House and coming from the political appointees inside the agency. But this mountain of lies really is, in some ways, the central premise of the Trump presidency, just as it was the central premise of the Trump campaign. Remember, it was in his announcement remarks when he announced that he was running for president, when he came down the escalator talking about rapists who were coming across the border. He later changed that to talk about terrorists, but it has always been the central core of his message that there are these dangerous people coming across the southern border. They may be criminals, they may be terrorists, and you need me to protect you. I mean, that is the demagogue's core message at heart. And the threat changes in his description, but it's always a threat that he describes. And one thing that's consistent is when you actually see his government's own data, it never backs up what he says about it.
NBC's Kelly O'Donnell joins us now from the White House. Kelly, I want to ask you about the politics of it. They are going in the wrong direction for this president. New polling shows that 51% of Americans blame Donald Trump for the shutdown. That's up 4% from before the holidays. He lost another Republican senator today. That's going in the wrong direction. You've covered a lot of addresses from the Oval Office from presidents. My old boss, George W. Bush, delivered a few. This is not what typically happens to any president. He also made a significant change to last night's message. These are the 4 Republicans who have peeled away, Senators Murkowski, Gardner, Collins, and I believe Tillis. But where are we that this White House, a president projecting, and as John Heilman said, the New York Times reporting that the president didn't believe in this communication strategy before he sat down and the cameras were on, and the political results speaking for themselves today, a clear setback.
Well, Nicole, this is one of the unusual days of what has been an unprecedented in many respects presidency, where we had the president saying on Capitol Hill he was feeling confident. He believed there was solidarity among reporters and was looking forward to a meeting with the principal negotiators for the Democrats, the House Speaker and Leader Schumer. And then a cold wind blew across the West Wing here, and that's both literal and figurative. As the weather fell apart here, so did the negotiations. And we saw them come out and say, they described the president leaving the meeting abruptly. Then, of course, the president himself acknowledging that through his tweets, followed by the vice president. So where are we now? From the heights, if you will, of the intended unity of an Oval Office address. That's really the kind of the backdrop of what any Oval Office address is intended to do, to inspire unity, to bring people together. And now we have the most fractious part of this multi-week kind of negotiating mess. And so what happens next? The feeling here when we saw this sort of crumbling in front of our own eyes in an unexpected way. We did not expect that the meeting would be as brief as it was, that the positions would be as hardened as they were. They've been hardened publicly, but we thought behind closed doors, with the opportunity to maybe get somewhere, with a lot of talk of going for a bigger deal, including things like some protections for certain qualified undocumented immigrants, things like that that have been thrown about as potential ways to give Democrats something they want and give the president something they want. Without that, now it feels, Nicole, like the only lever left is to pull the national emergency switch and to try to bypass Congress, at least short term. Or I got the sense from watching the vice president here right outside this door in the cold talking about this, trying to reset the narrative to say the Democrats are not willing to negotiate. Could that change the bubble at all? It certainly would be appealing to the conservative base. But as you know, the polling has shown that Democrats are not being blamed for this shutdown right now. So Nancy Pelosi is one of the most astute political craftspeople in the business. And so her saying no came with a lot of confidence from her sense of where Democrats are. So this is an impasse. If we haven't seen an impasse for 19 days, boy, you can see it now.
Kelly,
what's the next move?
Let me ask you if there's anyone on the president's staff. Kellyanne Conway used to be a pollster. Bill Shine helped run Fox News. They can read a poll, I think. Is there anyone that can say to the president, you're in a weaker position today than you were in 15 days ago? And when you said on national television, I'd be proud to own the shutdown, that can play in a loop over and over and over again. And no one with a brain is going to believe anything else. You have a weaker hand to play today. Take any deal you can get and go back to tweeting along with Fox and Friends, Mr. President.
Well, part of it was to do the Oval Office address and for the president to use a card we don't often see played, sympathy, empathy, a gut feeling on the humanitarian piece. That's not his area of strength, not what he typically displays. There was a bit of that in his Oval Office address last night. And you saw just a short time ago, Secretary Nielsen saying this is a crisis, trying to focus on the people side of this. That's where they thought this would be politically a narrow lane, but a movable lane. The personalities in the room seem to take this to a cold, dark place. And I think it's hard to imagine that they'd have another meeting. And when the president goes to the border, which he's expected to do, unless that changes based on this, is that another one of those sort of key moments where they can regroup and try to give him a different message? At the moment, the message out of the White House is the incremental bills that the House is trying to pass under new Democratic leadership. Veto threat, veto threat, veto threat. And now the walkout of all walkouts, really a striking day. And we've covered lots of unusual days in the arc of the Trump presidency. This day really does stand out as one where divided government, if you were waiting to see what it would look like, save this space, because boy, was it messy today.